The unexpected invitation. The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over the quiet town of Ashford. Its narrow streets and small-town charm seemed to lull life into a gentle, unhurried pace. Sarah, a kind-hearted woman in her early 40s, was finishing up her shift at the local grocery store. The long hours were exhausting, but it was the only way she could provide for her daughter, Leila. Layla was the light of Sarah's life, a spirited teenager who had faced more challenges than most adults ever would. A debilitating condition had left Leila confined to a wheelchair, and recently, the doctors had given them the heartbreaking news. Leila needed a life-saving surgery, and time was running out. Sarah tried to remain hopeful, but each passing day felt heavier than the last. The surgery was necessary, but it was also impossibly expensive, far beyond Sarah's means. She had exhausted every option for financial assistance, and now her only hope was a miracle. But the weight of this looming deadline pressed down on her like a constant shadow. As Sarah walked home, the soles of her shoes tapping softly against the pavement, her mind was consumed with thoughts of mounting bills, Leila's frail health, and the gnawing anxiety that she couldn't provide the one thing her daughter needed the most, life-saving surgery. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a distant, muffled voice. Glancing up, she saw a man sitting alone on a park bench, his body slouched, his posture defeated. The man's clothes were tattered, stained with dirt and grime, his face obscured by a thick, unkempt beard. His appearance was a stark contrast to the neatly trimmed lawns and picket fences of the neighborhood, and Sarah's first instinct was to look away. But something about the man's presence caught her attention. His weary posture, the sorrow in his eyes, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world with him. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. It would have been so easy to walk past him, to ignore the stranger on the bench, and continue her journey home. But she couldn't. It wasn't just that her heart couldn't ignore the suffering of another human being. It was that, in that moment, she saw a reflection of her own pain. The man was a stranger, but in some way, his loneliness, his battle against adversity, mirrored her own. Gathering her courage, Sarah approached him slowly. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice a mix of caution and concern. "Are you okay?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced up at her through tired eyes, his expression guarded. He looked as though he hadn't spoken to another person in days, maybe longer. His face was weathered, his eyes haunted by a kind of sorrow that Sarah couldn't quite place. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, cracked from disuse, as if the simple act of speaking was an effort. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his ragged appearance told a different story. His clothes were torn, and his skin was covered in layers of dirt, as though he hadn't had a proper bath in weeks. Sarah studied him for a moment, unsure if she was intruding, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her this wasn't just a man down on his luck. This was someone who had been through something, someone who had seen too much, who had lost too much. "You don't look fine," she said gently, offering him a sympathetic smile. "Maybe I can help you. Would you like something to eat? Or maybe a chance to clean up?" For a moment, the man didn't respond. His eyes flickered down to the small bag at his feet, a meager possession that seemed barely enough to carry a few scraps of his life. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and awkward. Sarah waited, her heart beating in her chest as she wondered if he would accept her offer. The man's gaze met hers again, and for the first time, there was a hint of something softer in his eyes. Relief, gratitude, maybe both. After a long pause, he nodded slowly, his voice quieter this time. That would be nice," he said, as if he was unsure whether to believe her. Sarah's heart gave a small leap of hope. She smiled at him, a smile that reached her eyes, and gestured for him to follow her. "Come with me," she said. "I live just around the corner." The walk to her home was slow and silent. Sarah kept a few steps ahead, but the man walked carefully behind her, keeping his distance as if unsure of her intentions. His presence was a stark contrast to the quiet, suburban streets they walked along, an unsettling reminder that there were people in the world who suffered in ways that most others could not even imagine. As they walked, Sarah couldn't help but steal glances at him. He seemed to be a man worn down by life, not just in body, but in spirit. His every movement was slow, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Despite his outward weariness, there was something almost dignified about him, something that made Sarah's heart ache with empathy. They reached Sarah's modest home, a small one-story house with faded shutters and a welcoming porch. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and she was proud of it. She opened the front door and stepped aside to let the man enter. He hesitated at first, looking uncertain, as though he had never been invited into a home before. "Please," Sarah urged, "come inside. I promise you're safe here." The man stepped into the small living room, his eyes scanning the room as if taking in every detail. He seemed nervous, uncomfortable, like someone who had long since lost the ability to trust others. Sarah motioned for him to sit on the couch while she went into the kitchen to prepare a meal. The sound of the man's heavy footsteps echoed behind her, and she couldn't help but notice how different it felt to have someone else in her home. She busied herself with preparing something simple, nothing fancy, just a quick meal of pasta and vegetables. But as she worked, she found herself wondering about the man. Who was he? What had happened to him? How did someone end up like this, alone and discarded by society? When the meal was ready, Sarah brought it to him, placing the plate carefully in front of him. The man looked at it for a moment, as if unsure how to react. Then, without a word, he began to eat. Sarah watched him for a few moments, a strange feeling of unease settling in her chest. There was something about this whole situation that felt off. But what? Was it simply the unknown? The man was a stranger after all, and in this world, that was always dangerous. She shook the thought away, trying to focus on the kindness she had shown him, the hope she had given him. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But as she watched the man devour the meal, there was an unsettling feeling growing inside her, a feeling that something more was going on than she had realized. And then, without warning, he spoke. "I've been waiting for this," he said, his voice low and almost reverent. "For a long time." Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "Waiting for what?" she asked, her voice unsure. The man looked up at her, his eyes locking with hers in a way that made her heart skip a beat. "Waiting for someone who would see me," he said simply. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "See you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man's gaze softened, and he looked down at the food in front of him. "I've been invisible for a long time," he said, almost to himself. "But I think you might just be the one who sees me." And in that moment, Sarah realized that this wasn't just a simple act of kindness. This was the beginning of something far bigger, something she couldn't yet understand. Unraveling the past. The sound of the man's voice echoed in Sarah's mind long after he had finished eating. His words, simple yet heavy, seemed to linger in the air, swirling around her with an unsettling intensity. "I think you might just be the one who sees me." It was a sentence that seemed to carry the weight of years, perhaps decades, of suffering, loneliness, and longing. Sarah sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her mind racing. She had invited a stranger into her home, yes, out of kindness, but also because something in her had urged her to. There was something in his eyes, a kind of desperation, that had drawn her in. But now she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this man than she had initially thought. He wasn't just someone down on his luck. There was a story here, a story he wasn't telling. She cleared her throat, trying to push the discomfort away. "Don't overthink it," she reminded herself. "You did a good thing. You offered him food, a safe place, and kindness. That's what matters." The man, who still hadn't introduced himself, had finished his meal and now sat silently, staring at his hands, his long fingers twisting together as if searching for something. For a few minutes, Sarah let the silence stretch between them, uncertain of what to say. It felt as if the space between them was thick with unsaid words, heavy with the weight of some untold truth. She broke the silence. "You don't have to tell me your story if you don't want to," she said softly, her voice calm yet filled with curiosity. "But if you want to talk, I'm here. I'm a good listener." The man looked up at her then, his gaze sharp and searching, almost as if he was weighing her words. After a moment, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "Maybe I should start with how I ended up on that park bench, but I don't think that's the part that matters." Sarah tilted her head slightly, intrigued by his response. "What do you mean?" The man hesitated, as if gathering his thoughts. He glanced out the window, as though the fading sunlight could offer him the right words. Finally, he let out a long breath and spoke again. "I'm not who I appear to be," he said, his tone heavy with something unspoken. "That man you saw earlier, the one on the park bench, he's not me. Not really. He's just a shell, a part of me I let die a long time ago." Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. She tried to keep her voice steady, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke, as though he were unveiling a truth too profound for the world to hear. "What do you mean? Are you saying you're not homeless? That you're someone else?" The man's gaze locked with hers, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt the full weight of his presence. His eyes were deep, as though they carried a lifetime of memories, of pain, of loss. His next words came slowly, measured, as if speaking the truth was an excruciating task. "I used to have everything," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I had a family, a job I loved, a life that was good. I didn't have to struggle like this. I didn't have to live like a ghost." Sarah frowned, her heart aching at the sorrow in his voice. "Then what happened? What changed?" The man paused, his eyes clouding over with memories he wasn't ready to relive. He shifted in his seat, his body tense, as though trying to hold back something too painful to let go of. After a long pause, he spoke again, his words coming out in a rush, as though once he started, there would be no stopping them. "It all started with the accident," he said. "My wife and daughter were in the car with me. I was driving, and it was raining. We were on our way to visit my mother-in-law. And then, I don't remember much, just the screeching of tires, the sound of metal twisting and breaking. When I woke up, I was lying in the wreckage. My body was broken, but I was alive. My wife, she didn't make it. Neither did my daughter." The room grew still. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had expected many things from this conversation, but this was something else entirely. The man's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if the very memory of that tragedy had seeped into the walls of her home. She could see the weight of it in his eyes, the loss, the grief. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." The man shook his head slowly, his eyes distant. "I didn't know how to keep going. I didn't know how to live in a world that felt so empty. I lost everything that mattered in one instant, and I couldn't make sense of it. The grief, it consumed me. I lost my job, my home, my family. I lost myself." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she listened to his pain. How could anyone survive something like that? She thought. How could they keep going after losing everything? The man continued, his voice growing quieter, more resigned. "I tried. I really did. I tried to pick up the pieces, but there was no glue strong enough to hold it all together. I didn't know where to go, who to turn to. So I ended up on the streets. People don't look at you the same when you're homeless. They don't see the person you were. They just see the dirt, the ragged clothes, the empty eyes. I became invisible. And for a long time, that's all I was. Someone you could walk past without even noticing." Sarah's heart broke for him. She had only known him for a few hours, but already she could feel the depth of his sorrow. The man she had invited into her home was not just a stranger. He was a shattered soul, a man who had been broken by life and left to roam the world without a sense of belonging. "I didn't think I'd ever see another person the way I saw you today," he continued, his voice softer now, almost reverent. "I didn't think anyone could look at me and see me, the person I used to be. I thought I was just lost." Sarah swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wasn't just hearing his story, she was feeling it. His pain, his loss, his loneliness, all of it was now part of her own heart. She had always believed in the power of kindness, but this was something more. This wasn't just about offering someone a meal or a place to rest. This was about offering them the chance to be seen, to be remembered, to be heard. The man turned his gaze toward her, his eyes filled with something else, something Sarah hadn't expected. "Hope." "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For seeing me." Sarah's chest tightened, and she found herself fighting back tears. She had no words to offer him, no answers to the questions he was asking himself. But for the first time in a long while, she felt as though she was standing on the edge of something profound, something that was about to change both of their lives in ways neither of them could predict. The man paused, as if unsure whether to continue, but there was a look in his eyes that told Sarah that he wasn't done yet. He had started to open up, to trust her in a way that no one else had. And as Sarah sat there, listening to the man's story, she knew that this moment, this unexpected encounter, was the beginning of something far greater than either of them could have imagined. But what was it? What had she just invited into her life, and what was about to unfold? The answers, Sarah knew, were just beginning to reveal themselves. The mysterious revelation. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, amber light through the window, Sarah sat quietly across from the man, still processing everything he had shared. The weight of his words pressed heavily on her heart, and for a moment, the world outside her small living room seemed distant, as though it had ceased to exist. Everything had become focused on this one fragile moment. A man who had lost everything, a woman trying to hold it all together, and the inexplicable connection between them. The man, who had finally introduced himself as Marcus, remained quiet, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the floor. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a mutual respect born of vulnerability and shared humanity. Sarah could feel the remnants of his grief hanging in the air, yet there was something else beneath it, a sense of something unfinished. She couldn't help but wonder what else lay beneath the surface of Marcus's story. He had shared his past with her, the pain of losing his family, the spiral into homelessness. But there was a flicker of something deeper, a hidden truth he wasn't quite ready to reveal. Sarah could sense it in the way he avoided certain details, in the way his eyes would momentarily cloud over when he spoke of the past. She didn't want to press him. She knew all too well how painful it could be to open old wounds, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Marcus than just the broken man sitting before her. "Marcus," she began gently, breaking the silence that had stretched on for a while. "I can see you've been through a lot, but there's something you haven't told me yet, isn't there?" He looked up at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable for a moment. She could feel his hesitation, the weight of the decision he was about to make. He didn't speak immediately, as though weighing the consequences of his words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're right," he said. "There's more, but I'm not sure I'm ready to tell you all of it. Not yet." Sarah's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She had only known him for a short time, but she already felt deeply connected to him. His pain was like an open wound, and it hurt her to see him carry it alone. "Take your time," Sarah said softly. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to say anything you're not ready to." The room fell silent once more, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Sarah couldn't help but wonder what Marcus was hiding, what had happened that was too painful even to mention. But for now, she respected his need for space, and she knew that sometimes healing took time. After a few moments, Marcus shifted slightly, breaking the silence with a deep sigh. He looked at Sarah, his eyes searching hers, as though trying to gauge whether she could handle the truth. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice more steady this time. "Something I never expected to share with anyone, let alone someone I just met." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" she asked gently, her voice encouraging, but not pushy. Marcus hesitated again, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He seemed to be trying to find the right words, but whatever he was about to reveal wasn't something he'd ever spoken aloud before. "I wasn't always just a husband and father," Marcus finally said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I had a life before all of this, a life that was far removed from the man I became after the accident." Sarah's brow furrowed as she listened closely. "What do you mean? Who were you before?" Marcus swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He seemed to wrestle with his own thoughts for a long moment before speaking again, this time with a quiet intensity. "I used to be someone important," he said, his voice barely audible. "I was a detective. A good one. I worked for the police department in a big city, dealing with some of the most difficult cases. I was respected, successful, even admired by my colleagues. But when I lost my family, I lost everything. I lost myself too. And it wasn't just the grief. It was the guilt." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A detective. She hadn't expected this. He had seemed so ordinary, so broken. But now, there was a weight to his words, an authority that came with his confession. "Guilt?" she echoed. "What guilt?" Marcus looked at her, his eyes haunted, filled with a mixture of sorrow and shame. "I was involved in something," he began slowly, his voice darkening. "Something I shouldn't have been. And when the accident happened, I wasn't just grieving. I was running from my past. From my mistakes. I didn't want to face what I'd done. I was living with a secret." Sarah's chest tightened as she leaned forward. "What do you mean? What secret?" Marcus's gaze shifted away from her, his face shadowed with regret. He looked as though he were fighting with himself, torn between the need to confess and the fear of what that might cost him. But something in Sarah's unwavering presence seemed to give him the courage he needed. "There was a case I was working on," Marcus said, his voice strained. "A case involving corruption within the department. I was on the verge of uncovering something big. But the deeper I got, the more dangerous it became. People I trusted started to act differently, and I realized I was in over my head. I should have stepped back. I should have walked away. But I didn't." Sarah felt a cold chill creep up her spine. "What happened?" Marcus's face darkened, his eyes clouding over as though the memories were too painful to relive. "I got too close. I started to dig into people who were much more powerful than I realized. People who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. And then, I found myself caught in the middle. I didn't know who to trust. One night, I was out in the field, trying to gather evidence, and I was followed. I didn't see it coming. I was attacked, beaten, and left for dead. They took everything. My career, my reputation, my sense of security. I couldn't go to the police for help, because they were the ones involved. I was on my own." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she tried to process what he was saying. A corrupt police department. People trying to silence him. The weight of the words hung heavily in the air, and for the first time, Sarah understood why Marcus had been so broken, so lost. He wasn't just a man who had lost his family. He was a man who had lost everything because of his commitment to justice. He had been betrayed, not just by the world, but by the very institution he had devoted his life to. "After everything went down, I couldn't stay in the city," Marcus continued, his voice hoarse. "I couldn't face anyone, not after what I had uncovered, not after what had happened to me. So I left. I went into hiding. And that's when I ended up here, in this small town. I thought if I could disappear, if I could fade into the background, maybe I could outrun the ghosts of my past." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to catch up with the magnitude of what Marcus had just revealed. He hadn't just been a victim of circumstance. He had been a man caught in a web of corruption, a man who had stood up for what was right and had paid the price for it. His fall from grace wasn't just the result of an accident or the loss of his family. It was the fallout from a world he could no longer escape. "You didn't deserve that," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't deserve any of it." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. For the first time since Sarah had met him, he allowed himself to show a flicker of hope. "I don't know why you're still here, why you're listening to me after everything I've said," he said quietly. "But thank you. Thank you for not turning away." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She had never imagined that a simple act of kindness, inviting a homeless man into her home, would lead her to uncover such a complicated, painful story. But now she understood. Marcus wasn't just a man who had lost everything. He was a man who had sacrificed his own future for the greater good. And in that moment, Sarah realized that her own journey was somehow connected to his. The answers she had been searching for were just beginning to unfold. But what would they mean for both of them? And how would their paths, once so separate, now intertwine in ways neither of them could anticipate? The mystery was only deepening, and the truth was far more dangerous and far more powerful than Sarah could have ever imagined. The unraveling of truth. The following days passed in a blur of uncertainty and growing tension. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had just begun to uncover something much bigger than herself. Marcus's revelation had changed everything. It wasn't just his pain she had invited into her home. It was his entire past, the complexities and dangers of a life filled with shadows and secrets. Marcus hadn't stayed long after that night, but Sarah knew deep down that he wasn't just a broken man. He was a man with a mission, someone who had tried to do the right thing, only to find that doing so had cost him everything. And now, as the days wore on, Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that his past was still lurking, just out of sight, like a storm waiting to break. One afternoon, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the stack of bills in front of her. Her thoughts were far from the overdue notices that cluttered the table. Instead, her mind was consumed by Marcus's story. She couldn't get the image of his weary face out of her mind, his eyes filled with the kind of sorrow that came from bearing the weight of a deep, unhealed wound. The thought of his involvement with corruption within the police department had gnawed at her. She knew the world wasn't as simple as it seemed. She'd seen enough hardship in her own life to understand that. But Marcus's world, his truth, was something entirely different. It was a world she had never encountered before, one where betrayal was the norm, and good people were punished for their integrity. And then there was the other thing, the nagging sense that she was in danger too, just by getting involved. She didn't know what it meant yet, but Sarah could feel the shift in the air, as though everything had suddenly become much more precarious. Marcus's enemies were out there somewhere, and she was getting too close. She had invited him into her home, but had she invited danger as well? Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft rattle of the doorbell. Sarah froze for a moment, her heart leaping in her chest. She wasn't expecting anyone. She wasn't expecting anything. Cautiously, she walked to the door, her hand trembling slightly as she grasped the handle. She opened the door to find a small package resting on the welcome mat. No return address, no markings, just a plain, unmarked box. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at it, feeling an instinctual sense of unease wash over her. Was this from Marcus? She wondered. He hadn't told her anything about sending her something. Or was it someone else? Someone who knew about Marcus, about her involvement with him. Sarah bent down and picked up the package, her fingers brushing against the cardboard as though it were a ticking time bomb. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the street for any signs of movement. The neighborhood was quiet, the world seemingly indifferent to the storm that was quietly building in the background of her life. With a deep breath, she stepped back inside, closing the door behind her. Her pulse quickened as she placed the package on the kitchen counter, studying it with a growing sense of dread. What could it be? And why had it been left here, without so much as a hint of who had sent it? Carefully, she cut open the tape, her fingers trembling slightly as she peeled back the layers of packaging. Inside, there was a single item, a small black notebook. It looked old, worn, as though it had been through many hands over many years. Its cover was plain, without any identifying marks. Sarah's heart raced as she picked it up, the weight of it both familiar and foreign at the same time. She flicked it open, and the first page was filled with handwritten notes in neat, precise handwriting. As she read, her stomach twisted in knots. The writing was cryptic, referring to names and dates and locations, names that seemed familiar, but that Sarah couldn't place. But the more she read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a random collection of thoughts. It was a record of someone's investigation, an investigation into corruption, into the very police department Marcus had worked for, the same department that had torn his life apart. And then, at the very end of the notebook, she found something that made her blood run cold, a single line of text that seemed to jump off the page. Marcus Mitchell. The truth is in his hands. Find him before it's too late. Her breath caught in her throat. The words seemed to echo in her mind, louder and louder, until they drowned out everything else. Marcus. The truth. And then the ominous warning. Find him before it's too late. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She couldn't ignore the fact that her involvement with Marcus had somehow led her into a much deeper, much more dangerous situation than she could have imagined. She wasn't just offering kindness anymore. She was now a part of something far more dangerous. Was Marcus in danger? Was she? And who had left this notebook on her doorstep? The questions spiraled in her mind, each one leading to more confusion, more fear. There was no turning back now. She could no longer pretend that everything would be fine, that she could simply help a man in need and move on with her life. This was bigger than her. It was bigger than Marcus. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized she was already tangled in something that threatened to consume everything she held dear. Her thoughts turned to Leela. What would happen to her if Sarah got caught up in all of this? Lila was her world. The very thought of her daughter being dragged into the chaos was enough to make her heart ache. But what could she do? She couldn't just walk away from Marcus now. Not after everything he had shared with her. He was a man who had risked everything for the truth, and Sarah knew that she couldn't turn her back on him, not when he needed her the most. She had already seen too much. The notebook was a warning, but it was also an invitation to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. It was as though someone had known that she would get involved, that she would be the one to stand by Marcus. And they were pushing her deeper into this web of deceit. What kind of truth was hidden here? Sarah wondered, her mind racing as she tried to piece everything together. And what would it cost to uncover it? At that moment, the doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent. Her heart skipped a beat, and she quickly moved to the door, her thoughts still reeling from the notebook's contents. Could it be someone from Marcus's past? Someone who knew about the investigation? Someone who wanted to silence him? Or worse, silence her? She opened the door cautiously, her breath catching in her throat when she saw who was standing on the other side. It was Marcus. But this time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a man Sarah didn't recognize, tall, dark, with a grim expression on his face. The moment Sarah saw him, her stomach dropped. The look in the man's eyes was one of calculation, of danger. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, his voice strained. "We need to talk, and I'm afraid the time for waiting is over." A chill ran down her spine as she stepped aside to let them in. Marcus's expression was different now. He wasn't just the broken man she had invited into her home days ago. There was something more in his eyes now. a sense of urgency, of fear, and perhaps, most unsettling of all, a sense of knowing. The man beside him didn't say a word, but his presence spoke volumes. Sarah felt the weight of his silence and the quiet menace that seemed to radiate from him. "What's going on?" Sarah asked, trying to steady her voice. "Who is he?" Marcus glanced at the man briefly before turning back to her. "His name is Detective Logan. He's with the department I used to work for, and he's here to make sure that the truth stays hidden." A sudden, gut-wrenching realization hit Sarah. The notebook, the warning, the secrets, it was all coming together now. She had been caught in the crossfire of something much darker than she had ever imagined, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to face it. "Sarah," Marcus continued, his voice low, "we need your help, and we need to leave now." The world had just turned upside down, and Sarah knew there was no going back. The breaking point. The moment Marcus and Detective Logan stepped through the door, the atmosphere in Sarah's small home shifted. The air seemed to thicken with tension, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Sarah stood frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. The unease that had taken root in her soul earlier now bloomed into full-blown anxiety. What was happening? Why was Marcus here with Detective Logan, and why did his presence feel like a warning? As Marcus closed the door behind him, the silence between them hung heavy, punctuated only by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of crickets outside. Detective Logan didn't speak, but his presence was overwhelming. He stood with his arms crossed, his face stoic, his eyes scanning the room with a sharp, calculating gaze. He didn't look like someone who had come for a friendly chat. "Sarah," Marcus said, his voice urgent but laced with an undercurrent of something else. "Fear. I know this is a lot, but we don't have much time. We need to go. Now." She could see the strain in his face, the desperation beneath the calm exterior. It was as though something had shifted in him, and the broken man who had once sat in her living room now appeared like a man on the run. His eyes darted to the windows, and Sarah could tell he was constantly assessing the situation, as if expecting danger at any moment. "Go. Go where?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. The fear she had felt in the pit of her stomach earlier was now spilling into her every word. "What's going on, Marcus? What's happening?" Marcus stepped forward, his face shadowed with the weight of unspoken truths. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of guilt and determination. "There's something I didn't tell you," he began, his voice low. "The notebook you found. It wasn't just a record. It was a map. A map to something bigger." He hesitated, swallowing hard as if he were struggling with the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "That notebook. It's the key to exposing the corruption in the department. There's a secret, one that goes deeper than anything I told you, and there are people out there who will stop at nothing to protect it." Sarah's mind raced, trying to process his words. What secret? And who are these people? What do they want from us? Marcus looked at Detective Logan, who had remained silent up until now. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged through shared experiences and perhaps shared danger. Detective Logan stepped forward then, his voice cold and direct. "It's bigger than Marcus. It's bigger than the department. We're talking about a network of corruption that goes all the way to the top. And I'm not just talking about bad cops. I'm talking about politicians, businessmen, people with power and influence who have used the department to cover their tracks for years." Detective Logan's voice was low but unyielding, as if he had seen this truth firsthand and knew how dangerous it was. "There are people in high places who will do anything to keep their secrets buried. And right now, you're in the crosshairs because of that notebook." Sarah's mind was spinning. She had never expected her act of kindness, offering a shower to a homeless man, a man she barely knew, to drag her into something this dangerous. She had thought she was doing the right thing, showing compassion for someone who had lost everything. Now, her life was being upended in ways she couldn't have imagined. "But why me?" she whispered, the question hanging in the air. Why is this happening to me? Marcus looked at her with an expression that was both apologetic and pained. Because you've seen too much. You're involved now, Sarah. They'll be watching you. They'll be watching us. Her stomach twisted. The weight of his words was suffocating. The danger wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was here, in her home, on her doorstep. She had opened the door to Marcus out of kindness, and now that same door was a gateway to something much darker. I don't understand, Sarah said, her voice shaking as she stepped back from them, overwhelmed by a rush of conflicting emotions. I don't know anything about any of this. I don't even know who to trust anymore. Marcus moved closer, his hand resting gently on her arm, grounding her with his touch. His voice was soft but insistent. Sarah, I didn't want you to be part of this. I never wanted anyone to get hurt. But now that you've found the notebook, now that you're involved, there's no turning back. You are part of this now, whether you want to be or not. Sarah felt a rush of panic. She had always tried to do the right thing, helping others, supporting her daughter, surviving the struggles of everyday life. But now, everything felt out of her control. The world around her was no longer the small, predictable town she had always known. It was a place where shadows moved behind closed doors, where trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Why don't we just go to the police? She suggested, her voice breaking with uncertainty. Isn't that what you used to do? You used to be a cop. Why don't we just tell the authorities? Marcus's face hardened, his jaw tightening at the mention of the police. He glanced at Detective Logan, who had a bitter smile on his face. Trust me, Sarah, Marcus said, his voice firm now. The police aren't the answer. They're part of the problem. The people we're dealing with. They control the police. They control the system. Going to them is like jumping into a fire, hoping it won't burn you. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What was he saying? The police were the problem. The institution that was supposed to protect them, to keep the peace, was compromised. The weight of that truth settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had known that the world wasn't always fair, but this was more than she had ever imagined. So what do we do? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Where do we go from here? Marcus and Detective Logan exchanged a look, and it was clear that they had already made their decision. There was no easy answer. The path they were about to walk would be filled with danger, uncertainty, and sacrifice. We run, Marcus said simply. We disappear. We go off the grid. It's the only way to stay alive. Wait, Sarah interrupted, her heart racing at the thought. You're asking me to leave everything behind. My daughter. My life. I'm not asking you to leave everything, Marcus replied, his voice filled with regret. I'm asking you to survive. Sarah's mind was reeling. She couldn't just walk away from Leela. Not without explanation, not without knowing her daughter would be safe. But what choice did she have? They were up against powerful forces that could destroy them in an instant if they stayed in one place for too long. As the weight of the decision hung heavily in the air, Sarah turned to look out the window. The world outside seemed the same, unchanged. But she knew, deep down, that everything had shifted. The peaceful, predictable life she had once known was gone, replaced by a reality that was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The ticking clock on the wall was no longer just a symbol of passing time. It was a reminder that every second mattered, that every choice carried consequences. And in this moment, Sarah had to decide whether she would stay and face the unknown, or walk away from everything she had ever known, hoping to find safety in a world that had suddenly become too chaotic to understand. Could she do it? Could she leave behind everything she loved? Before Sarah could make up her mind, Detective Logan spoke again, his voice low and firm. We don't have time for second-guessing, Sarah. We either go now, or it's over. Her mind screamed in protest. She couldn't just abandon everything. Everyone. But the harsh reality of the situation was clear. They were out of time. With a deep breath, Sarah looked at Marcus and then at Detective Logan. She knew she didn't have all the answers, but in that moment, she made a decision. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. She would protect her daughter, protect herself, and do everything in her power to bring the truth to light. "I'm in," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Let's go." And with that, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Sarah was no longer just a woman trying to survive in a small town. She was now a player in a much larger game, one where the stakes were higher than she could have ever imagined. And there was no turning back. The final revelation. The hours that followed felt like a blur to Sarah. She moved in a daze, her mind still trying to process everything that had happened in such a short span of time. One moment, she had been a hard-working mother, doing her best to care for her daughter. And now she was tangled in a web of corruption and danger that she couldn't unravel. Every step she took felt like walking on a tightrope, where one wrong move could send her plummeting into the unknown. Marcus and Detective Logan led the way as Sarah packed the few belongings she could carry, her hands trembling as she stuffed items into a duffel bag. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. They couldn't risk staying long enough to pack anything more substantial. The risk of being found was too great. The man who had once been a beacon of compassion in Sarah's life was now a fugitive, and Sarah, by extension, was one too. As they loaded up the car, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision she had made. There was no going back now. If they left, she might never see her daughter, Leela, again. And yet, the truth, the cold, hard truth, was that if they stayed, they would all be at risk. The network of corrupt officers, politicians, and businessmen had eyes everywhere. Even the walls of her own home weren't safe. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked, her voice strained as she sat in the back seat of the car, watching the dimly lit streets blur past her. Marcus glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his face unreadable. The usual warmth she had come to associate with him was gone, replaced by a quiet intensity. This wasn't the man she had helped. This was someone who had been forced into a corner, with no choice but to fight back. "We're going to a safe house," Marcus said, his voice grim. "I have a contact who can help us get off the grid. Once we're there, we'll figure out what to do next." "What if they're waiting for us?" Sarah asked, her mind still spinning. "What if they know where we're going?" "They don't know where we're going," Logan interjected from the passenger seat, his voice firm but cold. "We've covered our tracks. No one knows we're on the move, yet." The words hung in the air like a fragile promise. Sarah wanted to believe them, but she knew that in this game, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. Everything felt like a gamble, and every minute that passed was a roll of the dice. The car sped down the empty highway, the moonlight casting long shadows across the road. Sarah glanced out the window, watching the familiar world slip further and further away. She was leaving her old life behind, the small grocery store, the quiet evenings spent with Leela, the life she had fought so hard to build. She didn't know when or if she would ever return. Her thoughts drifted to Leela. What will she think? She had promised her daughter that everything would be okay, that no matter what happened, they would always have each other. And now Sarah had to walk away from that promise to keep them both safe. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to let herself break. There was no room for weakness now. She had to be strong for Leela, for herself, for everyone who was counting on her. The miles stretched on, and soon the city lights were replaced by dense woods and rolling hills. The landscape around them became more isolated, more desolate. Sarah could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on her. They weren't just driving away from their lives. They were driving away from everything they had ever known, into a future that was as uncertain as it was dangerous. "We're almost there," Marcus said, his voice low. He glanced at Logan, who nodded in return. The tension in the car was palpable, but it was a shared tension, one that came from the understanding that their survival now depended on their ability to remain unseen, unnoticed, and above all, silent. As they turned off the main road, the car bumped down a narrow gravel path that twisted into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches reaching out like silent sentinels guarding the secrets of the night. Sarah's heart raced in her chest as they approached a small, dilapidated cabin that seemed to emerge out of nowhere, hidden in the shadows. Marcus pulled the car to a stop, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was suffocating. "We're here," he said softly. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She had so many questions, so many fears. She had never imagined that her life would come to this, that she would be standing in the middle of nowhere, unsure of what the next step would be. The life she had known was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know how much more she could bear. "Are we safe here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Logan opened the car door and stepped out, his eyes scanning the woods around them. "For now, yes," he said, though his tone didn't offer much reassurance. "But we'll need to stay sharp. No one can know we're here." They unloaded the car quickly, carrying what little they had into the cabin. The place was old, dusty, and smelled of mildew, but it was secluded, an ideal hideout, far from prying eyes. Marcus led Sarah to a small room at the back, where a single bed and a wooden chair sat against the wall. There was no luxury here, no comfort, but it was a temporary refuge. And for now, that would have to be enough. As Sarah set her bag down on the bed, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing in on her. She had no idea how long they would stay here, or if they would ever be able to return to their old lives. The world they had known was gone, replaced by a new, brutal reality. Marcus stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his face etched with exhaustion. "You need to rest, Sarah. You've been through a lot." "I can't rest," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and fear. "I can't just sit here and pretend everything's okay. I'm not safe yet. None of us are. There are people looking for us, Marcus. People who don't care about us." "I know," he said quietly, his eyes dark with the weight of his own guilt. "But for now, this is the safest place we have. And we need to stay sharp." She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. There was always that nagging doubt, the gnawing fear in the back of her mind that they were being hunted, that they were running out of time. But as the minutes ticked by, the exhaustion of everything they had endured caught up with her. She collapsed onto the bed, her eyes heavy with the weight of her thoughts. Marcus stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. He seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "I never wanted this for you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted you to get involved in this. I didn't want to drag you into this world." Sarah looked up at him, meeting his gaze. Despite everything, the fear, the confusion, the danger, she didn't feel resentment. She felt understanding. She had seen the kind of person Marcus was, someone who would fight for what was right, no matter the cost. She knew that if she were in his shoes, she would have made the same choices. The cost of doing the right thing was high, and sometimes you had to take risks to expose the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. "You didn't drag me into anything," Sarah said, her voice steady. "I made my choice, and now we have to stick together." Marcus gave her a small, grateful smile before turning and walking out of the room, closing the door behind him. Sarah lay in the darkness, her mind racing. She had made it this far, and she would keep fighting. She had to. For Layla, for Marcus, for the truth. And just as she began to close her eyes, a sudden noise from outside the cabin jolted her awake. It was faint, but unmistakable, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Someone was out there. Her heart leaped into her throat. The fear that had been lurking in the back of her mind suddenly became real. They had been found. She quickly stood, her breath shallow, as she grabbed her bag and moved toward the window. Through the cracked panes, she saw headlights approaching. There was no time to waste. Whoever was out there was closing in fast. This was it, the moment they had been running from. And now, the final truth was about to be revealed. Would they survive this? Or would everything they had fought for come crashing down? The answer would come soon enough.